In a small town where factory layoffs left families struggling, one lunch lady's simple act of kindness became national news. When Ms. Marlene Rose was caught giving extra food to hungry students at Haven Heights Elementary, she faced losing the job she'd loved for 23 years. No one expected her story to reach NBA superstar LeBron James, or that his response would reveal a connection that would touch millions. At Haven Heights Elementary, where hallways echoed with children's laughter and cafeteria trays clattered with daily routines, Miss C's Rose had been serving more than just food. She'd been serving hope, one meal at a time, until the day the numbers caught up with her kindness. The morning sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon when Marlene Rose unlocked the back door of Haven Heights Elementary School's kitchen. Her footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as she flipped on the lights, bringing warmth to the stainless steel world that had been her second home for the past 23 years. "Another beautiful day to feed my babies," she whispered to herself, just like she did every morning. Her soft brown eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled, her silver hair neat under its hair net. She reached for her favorite apron, the one covered in cartoon vegetables that her students had painted for her last Mother's Day. The kitchen slowly came to life as Ms. Rose moved through her morning routine. The huge ovens hummed as they warmed up, and the massive mixers stood ready for another day of work. She checked her prep list, even though she knew it by heart. Whole wheat rolls, sweet potato fries. Baked, not fried, she'd insisted on that change years ago, and her famous garden surprise sauce that got kids to eat their vegetables without even realizing it. Her assistant Maria arrived at 6:30, right on schedule. "Morning, Ms. Rose. Ready for another day?" "Ready as ever, honey. Those children aren't going to feed themselves." Ms. Rose's laugh was warm and rich, like the hot chocolate she sometimes snuck to kids who looked like they were having a rough morning. As they worked, Ms. Rose told Maria about her weekend garden harvest. Her hands moved steadily, spreading whole wheat dough into perfect rolls, while she talked about her tomatoes and herbs. She'd started the garden years ago, and now she used some of her own vegetables in the school meals, with the principal's permission, of course. The kitchen filled with wonderful smells as the morning went on. Other cafeteria workers arrived, and soon the whole team was preparing for another busy day. Ms. Rose supervised everything, adding a pinch of seasoning here, adjusting the temperature there, making sure every dish was just right. At 10:45, she heard the first rumble of hungry voices in the hallway. The kindergarteners always came first, their little faces bright with excitement as they lined up at the cafeteria door. Ms. Rose positioned herself at the serving line, ready to greet each child by name. "Hi, Ms. Rose," squeaked Sarah Chen, her front tooth missing. "Are those your special rolls today?" "They sure are, sweetheart. Made them just for you." Ms. Rose winked as she added an extra roll to Sarah's tray. The lunch rush continued, a parade of hungry students filing past. Ms. Rose knew every face, every smile, and every worried frown. She noticed things that others might miss, like how Tommy Martinez, one of her favorite fifth graders, had started looking thinner lately. His clothes seemed a little looser, and his usually bright eyes had dark circles under them. When Tommy came through the line that day, Ms. Rose studied him carefully. He was wearing the same red t-shirt he'd worn twice last week, and his tray trembled slightly in his hands. "How you doing today, Tommy?" she asked, adding an extra scoop of mixed vegetables to his plate. "I'm okay, Ms. Rose." His voice was quiet, different from his usual cheerful chatter. "Your little sister Julia coming through later?" Tommy's eyes darted away. She brought lunch from home today." Ms. Rose knew that probably meant Julia hadn't brought any lunch at all. She'd been seeing more of that lately, ever since the big factory on the edge of town had laid off hundreds of workers. Tommy and Julia's dad had worked there, she remembered. As Tommy walked away, Ms. Rose noticed him slip his roll into his pocket, probably saving it for his sister, she thought, her heart aching. She'd seen that move before. She'd done it herself many years ago, when she was a hungry child trying to help feed her younger brothers. The lunch period continued, but Mrs. Rose's mind kept going back to Tommy. She watched him sit with his friends, laughing and talking like everything was normal, but she saw how he made his small portion of food last as long as possible. Later, during the brief break between lunch periods, Ms. Rose walked to the window overlooking the playground. The autumn leaves were starting to turn, painting the schoolyard in shades of red and gold. She remembered another autumn long ago, when a kind lunch lady had pretended not to notice, as young Marlene Rose took extra food for her hungry siblings. "What goes around comes around," she murmured, touching the window glass gently. The afternoon lunch period brought more students, more smiles, and more worried faces that Ms. Rose couldn't ignore. She noticed things. The kids who always asked if there were leftovers, the ones who never brought money for extra snacks, the ones who looked longingly at their friends' full trays. As she worked, she kept count in her head. 5 more kids than last week who seemed to need help. 2 who hadn't eaten at all yesterday. 3 who used to buy lunch, but now said they brought food from home, food she never actually saw them eat. When the last student had gone through the line, Ms. Rose began the afternoon cleaning routine. She wiped down counters and started the big dishwasher, but her movements were slower than usual. Her mind was working on a problem, turning it over and over like dough being kneaded. The kitchen gradually emptied as her staff finished their tasks and headed home. Ms. Rose stayed, as she always did, to finish the paperwork and prepare for tomorrow. She sat at her small desk in the corner, looking over the day's numbers. Meals served, inventory used, money collected. Everything had to balance perfectly. Mr. Peters, the new administrator, was very strict about that. But as she looked at her inventory sheets, then at the 8 perfectly good meals that hadn't been served and would have to be thrown away, something inside Ms. Rose shifted. She thought about Tommy's trembling hands and Sarah Chen's little sister, who had stopped coming through the lunch line 2 weeks ago. She thought about her own childhood and the lunch lady who had made such a difference in her life. Standing up from her desk, Ms. Rose walked to the industrial refrigerator. She opened the door and stood there for a long moment, feeling the cool air on her face as she looked at the shelves of food. Tomorrow's preparations were already done, everything measured and counted and recorded on her charts. Almost everything. She reached for her notebook and pencil, then paused. Through the kitchen window, she could see the last buses pulling away from the school. In one of them, she knew Tommy Martinez was probably already breaking his saved roll in half to share with his sister. Sidriziz. Rose closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her face. She pulled her notebook closer and began to write, her pencil moving quickly across the page as she made calculations and adjusted numbers. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, she knew exactly where to start. The kitchen was quiet now, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of Ms. Rose's pencil. Outside her window, the autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. But Ms. Rose barely noticed. She was too busy planning tomorrow's meals and figuring out how to make sure every child who came through her lunch line would have enough to eat, whether they could pay or not. She didn't know it yet, but that decision would change everything, not just for Tommy and the other hungry kids at Haven Heights Elementary, but for Ms. Rose herself, and for an entire community that was about to learn an unforgettable lesson about love, courage, and doing what's right, no matter the cost. The next morning, Ms. Rose arrived at Haven Heights even earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, but her mind was clear. She'd spent most of the night thinking about her plan, remembering a time long ago when she'd been in Tommy's shoes. As she unlocked the kitchen door, memories washed over her like warm water. She was 11 again, standing in line at her own school cafeteria, her stomach growling so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. That was the year her father had lost his job at the steel mill, the year everything had changed. But there had been Mrs. Henderson, the lunch lady with kind eyes and clever hands that somehow always managed to give a little extra to the kids who needed it most. "Food has a way of finding hungry hearts," she used to say. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Ms. Rose whispered to the empty kitchen. "I hope I can be half as brave as you were." She pulled out her notebook and started working on her new system. Had to be subtle. No child should ever feel embarrassed about needing help. She created a special mark on her serving sheets, a tiny star that only she would understand. It would help her track which children needed extra food, while her creative bookkeeping would keep the numbers looking right on paper. When Maria arrived, Ms. Rose was already elbow-deep in bread dough. "Maria, honey," she called out, "I'm trying something new with the portions today. Watch how I do it." Maria had worked with Ms. Rose long enough to understand that some things didn't need to be explained out loud. She nodded, her eyes soft with understanding, as Ms. Rose demonstrated how to make certain servings just a little more generous. The morning rush began, and Ms. Rose put her plan into action. When Tommy came through the line, she gave him what looked like a normal serving, but she'd carefully arranged it to include extra proteins and calories. "Tommy, would you mind helping me after school today? I could use a strong pair of hands to move some boxes." Tommy's eyes brightened a little. "Sure, Ms. Rose, I can stay." Throughout the day, Ms. Rose watched and noted. Sarah Chen's little sister came through the line today, looking nervous. Ms. Rose smiled warmly. "Try these sweet potato fries, honey. They're extra good today." The serving she gave was generous enough to share. Between lunch periods, Ms. Rose heard footsteps in the hallway. Mr. Peters, the new administrator, was doing his rounds. She quickly adjusted her serving sheets, making sure everything looked properly documented. He passed by without coming in, but she noticed his sharp eyes scanning the cafeteria. After school, Tommy showed up as promised. Ms. Rose had prepared a few boxes that actually needed moving, but she had another plan too. As they worked, she started telling stories about her own childhood. "You know, Tommy, when I was about your age, my daddy lost his job too." She watched his hands freeze for a moment on the box he was lifting. "Times were hard for a while. Really hard." Tommy set down the box carefully. "What? What did you do?" "We got by with help," she said softly. "There were people in our community who understood that sometimes good folks need a helping hand. No shame in that at all." She pulled out a paper bag she'd prepared earlier. "Here's some leftover rolls that would just go to waste otherwise. Maybe you and Julia would like them?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back quickly. "Ms. Rose, Now," she said briskly, turning to wipe down a counter. "Can't let good food go to waste. That's what my mama always said. You'd be doing me a favor, taking them home." After Tommy left, clutching the paper bag, Ms. Rose sat down at her desk and added another star to her notebook. In just one day, she'd identified 15 children who needed extra help. She thought about Mrs. Henderson again, wondering if she'd kept a similar notebook all those years ago. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Ms. Rose refined her system, finding creative ways to help the children who needed it most. Some days, it was leftover rolls that needed to be taken home. Other times it was too much soup that would just go to waste anyway. She became an expert at making portions look standard, while actually providing extra nutrition where it was needed most. Word spread among the struggling families, not through conversation, but through the silent understanding that passes between people facing similar challenges. More children started staying after school to help Ms. Rose, each leaving with a little extra food for their families. But Ms. Rose noticed other things spreading too. Whispers among the staff, questioning, looks from some teachers, and Mr. Peters making more frequent walks past the cafeteria. She knew she was taking a risk, but every time she thought about stopping, she remembered Tommy's trembling hands or saw Sarah Chen's little sister's grateful smile. One afternoon, as she was preparing her special bags for the after-school helpers, she heard Mr. Peters' voice in the hallway. He was talking to someone about inventory discrepancies and budget concerns. Ms. Rose's hands shook slightly as she quickly tucked the bags out of sight. That evening, as she was finishing her paperwork, she found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a note requesting her presence at a meeting with Mr. Peters the next morning to discuss cafeteria operations. Ms. Rose sat very still, her heart pounding. Through her window, she could see children boarding the late buses. Children who had eaten well today because of her choices. She thought about Mrs. Henderson again, wondering if she had ever faced a moment like this. Taking a deep breath, Ms. Rose straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She remembered something else. Mrs. Henderson used to say, "Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price, but not doing it costs even more." She pulled out her notebook and began documenting everything. Every extra portion, every creative solution, every child helped. If she had to explain herself, she would do it with honesty and pride. Because some promises, even silent ones, were too important to break. As she wrote, the autumn sun set outside her window, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight, Ms. Rose knew in her heart that she had chosen the right path. The children of Haven Heights Elementary would not go hungry. Not on her watch. What she didn't know was that tomorrow's meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would test not just her courage, but the very heart of the entire Haven Heights community. Rose arrived at Haven Heights the next morning just as the sun was rising. Her notebook was tucked safely in her bag, filled with carefully documented notes about every extra meal she'd provided. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the kitchen door, but her face was calm and determined. Mr. Peters was already waiting in his office. Through the window, Ms. Rose could see him arranging papers on his desk, his face serious under the fluorescent lights. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and knocked on his door. "Come in, Mrs. Rose." Mr. Peters didn't look up from his papers. "Please, have a seat." The chair was cold and hard. Ms. Rose sat with her hands folded in her lap, her notebook waiting quietly in her bag. On Mr. Peters' desk, she could see spreadsheets covered in red marks and circles. "Mrs. Rose, I've been reviewing our cafeteria numbers for the past month." He finally looked up, his glasses reflecting the morning light. "Would you care to explain why our inventory counts don't match our sales records?" Before she could answer, he started pulling out more papers. "According to our records, we're serving fewer meals than last year, and yet we're going through more food. The numbers simply don't add up." Ms. Rose took a slow, steady breath. She thought of Tommy's grateful eyes, of Sarah Chen's little sisters, smile of all the children who needed help. "Mr. Peters, if I could explain, please do." His voice was sharp. "Because right now, I'm looking at a serious discrepancy that could cost our school thousands of dollars." Just then, they heard voices in the hallway. Early morning students arriving for breakfast. Ms. Rose's heart ached, knowing some of them were counting on her for their first meal of the day. "Mr. Peters," she began again, pulling out her notebook, "I keep careful records of everything." "Oh, I'm sure you do." He picked up another paper. "Like these extra bread rolls that keep disappearing? Or the mysterious increase in our milk inventory usage?" Through the office window, Ms. Rose could see Maria and the other kitchen staff arriving. They kept glancing nervously toward Mr. Peters's office as they started their morning preparations. "Sir, if you'll let me explain about the children." "The children?" Mr. Peters stood up suddenly, his chair rolling back. "Mrs. Rose, this isn't about the children. This is about rules and regulations. This is about budgets and accountability." Ms. Rose felt something shift inside her, like a pot finally boiling over. She stood up too, her voice firm but kind. "Mr. Peters, this is exactly about the children. Every single number in those reports represents a hungry child who needed help." She opened her notebook and laid it on his desk. "Here are my records. Every extra portion, every missing roll, every disappeared carton of milk. They all went to students whose families are struggling since the factory layoffs. Children who would otherwise go hungry." Mr. Peters's face reddened. "That's not your decision to make. There are proper channels for families who need assistance. Forms to fill out, procedures to follow." "Forms don't fill empty stomachs," Ms. Rose said quietly. "And some families are too proud to ask for help, or don't know how, or are scared to draw attention to their situation." Outside the office, Tommy had arrived early to help with breakfast setup, as he did most mornings now. He could hear the raised voices through the door, and he froze, a stack of trays in his hands. "Mrs. Rose, I'm afraid this is very serious." Mr. Peters sat back down, straightening his tie. "You've been deliberately manipulating inventory records." "I've been feeding hungry children," she corrected him gently, "and misappropriating school resources," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "I have no choice but to—" The door burst open. Maria stood there, her face flushed. "Mr. Peters, you can't fire Ms. Rose. We all knew what she was doing, and we all helped." Behind her, other cafeteria workers nodded, clustering in the doorway. "She's only doing what any decent person would do," someone called out. Mr. Peters stood again, his face getting redder. "This is a private meeting? Then maybe it should be public." Tommy's voice was small but clear from where he stood behind the cafeteria workers. "Everyone should know how Ms. Rose helps kids like me and my sister when we're hungry." The hallway had grown quieter. Students arriving for breakfast were stopping to watch, and a few teachers had appeared in their doorways. Mr. Peters looked around, his jaw tight. "Everyone back to work. Mrs. Rose?" He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. "This is your termination notice. You have until the end of the day to clear out your belongings." A gasp went through the gathered crowd. Tommy dropped his stack of trays with a clatter that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. Ms. Rose stood very still, her back straight, and her head high. "Mr. Peters, before you make this final, I hope you'll think about something. 23 years ago, I started working here because I remembered what it was like to be a hungry child. I remembered my own school's lunch lady, Mrs. Henderson, who found ways to help children like me." She picked up her notebook. "Every number in here represents a child who went home with a full stomach instead of an empty one. If that's worth firing me for, then I accept your decision with pride." She turned to leave, but Mr. Peters's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Rose, wait." She turned back. His face had changed somehow, a flicker of something crossing it that she couldn't quite read. He started, then stopped, looking down at his desk. "I need to review this situation with the school board. Until then," he seemed to be struggling with something internal. "Until then, please continue your regular duties." As Ms. Rose left his office, the crowd quickly dispersed. But word of what had happened spread through Haven Heights Elementary like wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew that Ms. Rose, the lunch lady who had never turned away a hungry child, might lose her job for feeding those who couldn't pay. What no one knew, not even Ms. Rose, was that Tommy Martinez had recorded the entire confrontation on his phone. That night, with tears in his eyes and determination in his heart, he would upload that video to social media, having no idea that it would catch the attention of someone who could change everything. In his darkened bedroom, Tommy's thumb hovered over the post button. In Ms. Rose's kitchen, she sat alone with her notebook, wondering if she'd made her last school lunch. And in Mr. Peters's office, the administrator sat staring at an old photograph of a young boy standing in a lunch line, his eyes hungry and ashamed, while a kind lunch lady pretended not to notice him taking extra food. Tommy Martinez pressed post and watched his phone screen glow in the darkness. The video of Ms. Rose standing up to Mr. Peters was now live on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, along with the caption he'd spent an hour perfecting. "Our lunch lady might get fired for feeding hungry kids. Please help save Ms. Rose." Save Ms. Rose. Charter Haven Heights, Jock School Lunch. He tucked his phone under his pillow when he heard his dad's footsteps in the hallway. For the first time in weeks, his stomach wasn't empty as he fell asleep. Ms. Rose had made sure he and Julia had enough food to take home. He just hoped he'd done enough to help her in return. By morning, Tommy's video had already been shared thousands of times. As students arrived at Haven Heights Elementary, phones were buzzing with notifications. Parents dropping off their children were talking in clusters near the entrance, many of them sharing their own stories about Ms. Rose's kindness. "She always makes sure my Bobby gets enough to eat," one mother said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Ever since my husband's medical bills." "Remember when she started that weekend backpack program?" another parent added. "She told everyone it was surplus food that would go to waste anyway." Inside the cafeteria, Ms. Rose worked quietly, trying to keep things normal for the children. But she noticed more phones pointed her way, more whispers, more parents peeking through the cafeteria windows. Maria showed her the video during their morning break. "Tommy recorded everything," Maria explained, her eyes bright. "And people are furious about what's happening to you. Look at the comments." Ms. Rose adjusted her reading glasses and looked at Maria's phone. The comments brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Ms. Rose fed my kids when I lost my job last year. She never made them feel ashamed. I went to Haven Heights 20 years ago. Ms. Rose was kind then, too. Some things never change. This is what real heroes look like. Save Ms. Rose." By lunchtime, local news vans had appeared in the school parking lot. Mr. Peters spent the morning rushing between his office and the district headquarters, his face growing more strained with each trip. The school secretary's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters and concerned community members. Parents began organizing through a hastily created Facebook group called Friends of Ms. Rose. Someone designed a logo, a heart made of kitchen utensils, and by afternoon, a local print shop was making T-shirts and yard signs. Tommy couldn't believe how quickly things were moving. His video had been picked up by several news stations, and a reporter even interviewed him after, getting his parents' permission. "Ms. Rose doesn't just give us food," he told the reporter, his voice stronger than he expected. "She gives us dignity. She makes sure nobody feels different or ashamed about needing help." The reporter wiped away a tear during the interview, not even trying to hide it. That evening, a crowd gathered outside Haven Heights Elementary. Hundreds of people held candles and homemade signs. "Kids need food more than rules," and "Ms. Rose feeds our hearts," and "Hunger doesn't wait for paperwork." Ms. Rose tried to slip out the back door after finishing her cleanup, but Maria and the other kitchen staff wouldn't let her leave alone. When she stepped outside, the crowd began to cheer. Former students, now adults with their own children, rushed to hug her. Current students pressed forward to give her drawings and cards. Sarah Chen's mother, who owned the local Chinese restaurant, had brought enough food to feed everyone. Other local restaurants followed suit, turning the protest into an impromptu community dinner. People shared stories about Ms. Rose while sharing meals, just as she had taught them to do. The local news covered it live. In an extraordinary display of community support, hundreds have gathered to support a school lunch lady who might lose her job for feeding hungry students. National news outlets picked up the story next. Footage of Ms. Rose gently explaining her actions to Mr. Peters played on major networks. Social media exploded with similar stories from around the country. Other cafeteria workers who found ways to help hungry children, often at risk to their own jobs. A state senator tweeted about introducing legislation to prevent situations like this. Celebrities began sharing Tommy's video. An online petition demanding Ms. Rose keep her job reached hundreds of thousands of signatures in hours, but it was a tweet late that night that would change everything. As Tommy got ready for bed, his phone buzzed with a notification that made his heart stop. The most famous basketball player in the world had shared his video with a message. King James. "This hits home. When I was a kid, school lunch was sometimes the only meal I could count on. The love and courage of people like Ms. Rose change lives. I should know. Haven Heights, I hear you. Let me make a call. Save Ms. Rose." Tommy stared at his phone screen, his hands shaking. LeBron James, his hero, the greatest basketball player ever, had seen his video, had shared it, was going to help. Across town, Ms. Rose sat at her kitchen table, overwhelmed by the events of the day. Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support, but she wasn't looking at them anymore. Instead, she was writing in her notebook. Not inventory numbers this time, but the names of every child she'd ever helped, every small kindness she'd tried to pass on, every lesson she'd learned from Mrs. Henderson so long ago. The media frenzy was still building, the community was still mobilizing, and somewhere in Los Angeles, LeBron James was making a phone call that would turn this small-town story into a national movement. But Ms. Rose didn't know any of that yet. She just knew that tomorrow morning she would get up early as always, unlock the kitchen door, and make sure every child who came through her line had enough to eat. Because that's what Mrs. Henderson would have done. That's what any person with a heart would do. And maybe, just maybe, that simple truth would be enough to change everything. The next morning, Haven Heights Elementary looked different. News vans filled the parking lot, and a crowd of reporters stood waiting at the school entrance. Security guards had been posted to keep them from entering the building. But Ms. Rose arrived at her usual early hour, slipping in through the kitchen door as she always had. What she didn't expect was to find Mr. Peters already in the kitchen, sitting at her small desk with his head in his hands. "Mr. Peters?" she said softly. He looked up, and Ms. Rose was startled to see his eyes were red. Without a word, he pushed a paper across the desk toward her. It was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The photo showed a school cafeteria from decades ago. And there, in the lunch line, stood a skinny boy who could only be a young Mr. Peters. "That was me," he said, his voice rough. "At Franklin Elementary, 1985. And that," he pointed to a figure, in a hairnet behind the lunch counter. "That was my Mrs. Henderson." Ms. Rose sat down slowly, her heart pounding. "You?" "I was that hungry kid once," he whispered, "the one who needed extra food but was too ashamed to ask. And now I've become—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Before Ms. Rose could respond, Maria burst into the kitchen. "Ms. Rose, you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing a video that was going viral. It was LeBron James sitting in what looked like his home gym, speaking directly to the camera. "When I was growing up in Akron, Ohio, there were days when school lunch was all I had to eat. But there were angels in those cafeterias. People like Ms. Rose who understood that rules sometimes need to bend so children can stand tall. Today, I'm sharing my story because Haven Heights Elementary needs to understand something. This isn't just about one lunch lady or one school. This is about who we are as a community, as a country." The video cut to old photos of a young LeBron in his school cafeteria, then to statistics about childhood hunger in America. Then back to LeBron. "I'm not just tweeting about this, I'm taking action." Through the LeBron James Family Foundation, we're establishing the Mrs. Henderson Legacy Fund, named after Ms. Rose's own inspiration. This fund will support school nutrition programs and protect cafeteria workers who go above and beyond to feed hungry kids. The kitchen staff had gathered around Maria's phone, tears streaming down many faces. But LeBron wasn't finished. "And to Haven Heights Elementary, I've got something special planned. Stay tuned. Sometimes the biggest games aren't played on any court. They're played in cafeterias and classrooms, where real heroes work every day." Save Ms. Rose. The video ended, but its impact was just beginning. Within hours, other professional athletes started sharing their own school lunch stories. Celebrities offered to match LeBron's foundation funding. Politicians from both parties began calling for changes to school lunch programs. By midday, the school board announced an emergency meeting for that evening. The superintendent herself arrived at Haven Heights, walking past the growing crowd of supporters to meet with Mr. Peters. Tommy watched it all unfold from his classes, sneaking peeks at his phone whenever he could. His video had now been viewed millions of times. News organizations wanted to interview him. But most importantly, when he went through the lunch line, Ms. Rose was still there, still making sure every child had enough to eat. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Mr. Peters called an all-school assembly. As students filed into the gymnasium, they saw news cameras had been allowed inside for the first time. Mr. Peters stood at the microphone, looking nervous but determined. Ms. Rose sat on the stage behind him, confused about why she'd been asked to be there. "Yesterday," Mr. Peters began, his voice shaking slightly, "I made a serious mistake. I forgot something important, something I never should have forgotten." He pulled out the old newspaper clipping and held it up. "When I was your age, I was a hungry kid. My father had lost his job, just like many of your parents have. And there was a lunch lady, just like Ms. Rose, who helped me survive that time. She never made me feel ashamed. She just made sure I had enough to eat." He turned to face Miss Rose. "I became so focused on rules and budgets that that I forgot what it felt like to be that hungry child. I forgot that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Just then, the gymnasium doors opened. The superintendent walked in, followed by the entire school board. She took the microphone from Mr. Peters. "We've called this assembly because we have an announcement to make. But first," she looked up at the ceiling, "we have a special guest." The giant screen used for pep rallies flickered to life, and there, live via video call, was LeBron James. The gymnasium erupted in cheers. Tommy, sitting with his class, felt tears running down his face. On stage, Ms. Rose pressed her hands to her heart. "Haven Heights!" LeBron's voice boomed through the speakers. "I wish I could be there in person, but I couldn't wait to tell you this myself." The Mrs. Henderson Legacy Fund isn't just about protecting lunch ladies who help hungry kids. It's about changing the system so they don't have to break rules to do the right thing. He leaned closer to his camera. "Ms. Rose, you're not just saving children from hunger. You're saving them from shame, from feeling like they don't matter. I know, because someone like you saved me once. And today, we're going to make sure you can keep saving others." The superintendent stepped forward again. The school board has unanimously voted to create a new position, Director of Food Security and Student Wellness. "Ms. Rose, we'd like to offer you this position, with full authority to help any child in need. No questions asked." The gymnasium exploded with applause. Students jumped to their feet, cheering. Teachers wiped away tears. And Mr. Peters, still holding his old newspaper clipping, was the first to start the standing ovation. But LeBron had one more surprise. "Tommy Martinez!" he called out. "Where's Tommy?" Tommy froze as his classmates pushed him to stand up. "Your video didn't just help save Ms. Rose's job, it started a movement. How would you like to come to Los Angeles this summer and help me launch the National Mrs. Henderson Legacy Program? We need young leaders like you to help us change things across the country." As Tommy stood there, stunned, Ms. Rose walked down from the stage and wrapped him in a warm hug. Just like she'd done thousands of times before, when children needed more than just food to fill their emptiness. The assembly continued, but Ms. Rose's mind drifted back to her own Mrs. Henderson. "We did it," she whispered to herself. "We really did it." But even she didn't know that the biggest surprise was still to come. Because Mr. Peters was about to share one final secret, one that would connect everything in a way no one could have imagined. As the assembly was ending and students began filing out of the gymnasium, Mr. Peters approached the microphone one more time. His hands were shaking as he held up the old newspaper clipping again. "Ms. Rose," he said quietly into the microphone, "there's something else you need to see." The remaining students and teachers grew quiet as Mr. Peters walked across the stage to where Ms. Rose sat. He handed her the yellowed paper, pointing to the lunch lady in the photograph. Ms. Rose adjusted her reading glasses, squinting at the fuzzy image. Suddenly, her hand flew to her mouth. "But that's... You're Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Peters finished. "The same Mrs. Henderson who helped me when I was a hungry child. And now I understand why you've been doing exactly what she did." The gymnasium was absolutely silent as Ms. Rose stared at the photograph, tears streaming down her face. "All this time," she whispered, "all this time, we were connected by her kindness." LeBron, still on the video screen, leaned forward. "Wait, what's happening? Can someone fill me in?" Tommy, who was closest to the stage, grabbed a microphone. "Ms. Rose and Mr. Peters had the same lunch lady when they were kids. The real Mrs. Henderson helped both of them. The same Mrs. Henderson who taught me that sometimes rules need to bend. Ms. Rose said softly. "The same Mrs. Henderson who saved my life with extra food and quiet dignity," Mr. Peters added. "And I almost forgot her most important lesson." The superintendent stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. "This is more than just coincidence. This is what happens when kindness creates ripples across generations." LeBron was visibly moved. On the giant screen, "Now that's what I call a full-circle moment." Mrs. Henderson's legacy didn't just inspire one person. It inspired a chain reaction of kindness that's still going strong. Maria, who had been recording everything on her phone, suddenly called out, "It's going viral again! People are sharing the connection story with full-circle kindness." But Ms. Rose wasn't paying attention to the social media explosion. She was lost in memories, thinking about all the times Mrs. Henderson had helped her, and how those acts of kindness had shaped her entire life. "I remember," Mr. Peters said, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to say something about kindness finding its way home." "Food has a way of finding hungry hearts," Ms. Rose quoted, looking up in surprise. "That's what she always told me, too." The gymnasium erupted in applause again, but this time it was different, softer, more meaningful, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something magical. LeBron spoke up from the screen. "You know what? We need to make this even bigger. Mr. Peters, how would you like to join Tommy and Ms. Rose in Los Angeles this summer? I think we need all three of you to help launch this program. Your story, this connection, it shows exactly why this mission is so important." The superintendent raised her hand for attention. "And I have one more announcement. The school board has unanimously voted to rename our cafeteria the Henderson Rose Kitchen, to honor both the legacy that inspired us and the woman who carries it forward." Ms. Rose stood up, shaking her head. "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly." "Yes, you can," Mr. Peters interrupted gently, "because it's not just about you or Mrs. Henderson. It's about every child who needs to know that someone cares, that help is available, that they don't have to be ashamed." Tommy stepped onto the stage, still holding his phone. "Ms. Rose, look at this. People all over the country are sharing stories about their own lunch ladies who helped them. You and Mrs. Henderson, you're inspiring people everywhere to be kinder, to do more." The gymnasium doors opened again as parents began arriving for a specially called evening meeting. They carried trays of food, a community potluck to celebrate. Sarah Chen's mother had brought enough dumplings to feed an army. Other families brought dishes representing their own cultures and traditions. As people began setting up tables and sharing food, Ms. Rose looked around at the scene before her. Children were helping serve food to each other. Parents were making sure everyone had enough to eat. The cafeteria staff were teaching students how to properly arrange serving stations. "This," she said, her voice carrying in the now quiet gymnasium, "this is what Mrs. Henderson meant about food finding hungry hearts. It's not just about filling empty stomachs, it's about filling empty spirits. It's about community." Mr. Peters nodded. "And sometimes it takes a full-circle moment to remind us what really matters." LeBron, still watching from the screen, smiled. "Haven Heights, you've taught the whole country something important today. And this is just the beginning." As families shared meals and stories, as children played and parents talked, as reporters captured it all for the evening news, Ms. Rose sat at one of the tables, her old notebook open before her. But instead of counting inventory, she was writing a letter. "Dear Mrs. Henderson," she wrote, "today I learned that your kindness reached even further than I knew. Today I learned that every small act of caring creates ripples we might never see. Today I learned that sometimes those ripples come full circle in the most amazing ways. She looked up to see Tommy teaching younger students how to properly set up a serving line, just as she had taught him. She watched Mr. Peters helping distribute food, the stiffness gone from his shoulders, the joy of service returned to his face. She saw her community coming together, not just to support her, but to support each other. And she knew, somehow, that Mrs. Henderson was smiling down on all of it. Because sometimes the greatest victories don't come with trophies or medals. Sometimes they come in shared meals, in quiet dignity, in communities remembering how to care for each other. Sometimes they come in full circles of kindness that span generations. And sometimes, just sometimes, they come in school cafeterias, where lunch ladies like Mrs. Henderson and Ms. Rose understand that feeding hungry hearts is just as important as feeding hungry children. 1 year later, the Henderson Rose kitchen at Haven Heights Elementary was buzzing with activity. Sunlight streamed through, new windows that had been added during the summer renovation, making the whole space feel warm and welcoming. But the biggest changes weren't in the building. They were in the people inside it. Tommy Martinez adjusted his new badge that read Student Nutrition Ambassador as he helped younger students learn about the salad bar. He'd grown taller over the past year and more confident too. His father had found a new job at the LeBron James Family Foundation's local office, where they were expanding the school nutrition program across the state. Remember, Tommy told a group of first graders, everything here is free for everyone. No questions asked, no forms needed. That's the Henderson Rose way. At her desk in her new office, really just a converted storage room, but she loved it, Ms. Rose reviewed reports from other schools that had adopted their program. Pictures covered her walls. Mrs. Henderson's old newspaper clipping, photos from their summer trip to Los Angeles, and her favorite, a group shot of her, Tommy, and Mr. Peters with LeBron James at the national launch of the Mrs. Henderson Legacy Program. The program had spread to over 50 schools now, with more joining every month. Each school had its own way of doing things, but they all followed the core principle. No child should ever go hungry, and no child should ever feel ashamed about needing help. Mr. Peters knocked on her door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He'd changed too. His suits were less stiff, his smile came easier, and he'd become one of the program's strongest advocates. "Ready for the video call?" he asked, setting down her coffee. Ms. Rose nodded, turning on her computer. Every month, she led a training session for cafeteria workers from around the country, teaching them not just about food distribution, but about dignity, compassion, and community building. "You know what Mrs. Henderson would say about all this?" Mr. Peters asked, helping her set up the camera. "Food finds hungry hearts," they said together, laughing. The faces that appeared on her screen were eager to learn. Lunch ladies from Seattle. To Miami, cafeteria workers from small towns and big cities, all wanting to know how they could make a difference in their own communities. "First thing to remember," Ms. Rose began, "is that we're not just feeding bodies, we're feeding spirits. Every child who comes through your line is carrying their own story." As she spoke, Maria poked her head in. "Ms. Rose, you've got to. See this." She held up her phone, showing a live video from the White House. The president was signing the Mrs. Henderson Act, a new law that expanded free school meals nationwide and protected cafeteria workers who helped students in need. Tommy and his family were there for the ceremony, along with LeBron James and other advocates. "Look who's standing right behind the president," Maria said excitedly. Ms. Rose squinted at the screen, then gasped. Sarah Chen's mother was there, representing the local business community that had supported Haven Heights during their struggle. She was wearing one of the original Save Ms. Rose t-shirts, now a symbol of the movement that had grown far beyond their small town. Back in the cafeteria, things had changed in other ways too. The old lunch line was gone, replaced by community-style serving stations where students could eat together without anyone knowing who paid and who didn't. Older students helped younger ones. Teachers and parents regularly joined students for meals. The kitchen had become the heart of the school in a whole new way. Julia Martinez, Tommy's sister, was now leading the school's weekend backpack program, making sure students had food to take home. She'd overcome her own shame about needing help and had become a fierce advocate for other students. The factory that had closed was reopening too, but with a new purpose. The LeBron James Family Foundation had helped convert it into a food distribution center and job training facility. Many of the parents who had lost their jobs were working there now, helping to solve the same problems that had once affected their own families. That afternoon, as Ms. Rose finished her virtual training session, she received an email that made her cry happy tears. A student she'd helped 20 years ago had just been elected to the state legislature, running on a platform that included school nutrition reform. In his victory speech, he'd talked about a lunch lady who had taught him that kindness was more important than rules. "The ripples never stop," Mr. Peters said softly, reading the email over her shoulder. "Mrs. Henderson helped us. We helped others, and they're helping even more people now." At the end of the day, as students were leaving, a small first grader tugged on Ms. Rose's apron. "Ms. Rose, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." Ms. Rose knelt down to the child's level. "Honey, just be yourself. But remember what we always say here." The little girl nodded solemnly. "Food finds hungry hearts." "That's right, Ms." Rose smiled. "And so does kindness." Later, as she was closing up the kitchen, Ms. Rose took out her old notebook. Its pages were filled with years of numbers and notes, but in the back, she'd started something new. Each day, she wrote down one act of kindness she'd witnessed: students sharing lunches, parents helping other parents, teachers going above and beyond. Today's entry read, "First grader gave half her cookie to a kindergartner who looked sad." Mrs. Henderson would be proud. Her legacy lives on in ways she never could have imagined. As she locked up the Henderson Rose kitchen for the night, Miss Uvers, Rose looked at the plaque by the door. Under Mrs. Henderson's picture and her own, there was a quote: "In this kitchen, we feed more than bodies. We feed hopes, dreams, and hearts. No one goes hungry here, for food or for kindness." And somewhere, she was sure, Mrs. Henderson was smiling, knowing that her simple acts of kindness had sparked a movement that would feed hungry hearts for generations to come. Because that's the thing about kindness. Like the meals served in school cafeterias across the country, it finds its way to those who need it most. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it comes back around in ways that change not just one life or one school, but an entire nation. That's the power of a lunch lady's love. That's the miracle of food finding hungry hearts. That's the story of Haven Heights, where it all began. And that's just the beginning. Thanks for listening. This story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love hearing from all corners of the world. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to hear another inspiring story, click the video appearing on your screen right now.